Margaret lived in a small town where life was quiet and predictable. She was an old woman now, with silver hair neatly tied back and soft lines across her face that showed years of both laughter and hardship. To most people in the town, she was simply Mrs. Margaret from Maple Street, the woman who walked slowly with her shopping bag, greeted everyone politely, and tended to the flowers in her little garden. Children saw her as the sweet old lady who sometimes handed them cookies when they passed by. Adults saw her as someone ordinary, living out her last years in silence. Nobody knew that inside her heart lived a story much greater than anyone imagined. For decades Margaret had lived alone. Her husband had passed away long ago, and her children were grown with families of their own in faraway cities. She never complained about being lonely. She kept herself busy with books, gardening, and caring for the few stray cats that always seemed to find their way to her porch. What she never shared with anyone was that in her younger years, she had been a gifted pianist. She had played music in churches, in local halls, and even for a short time in a small orchestra. But as life moved forward, marriage, raising children, working to support her family, her piano days faded into the background. She no longer had a piano at home. The only place she could sometimes touch the keys was at church, but even there she kept her talent hidden. For Margaret, music had become a private memory, a secret treasure she carried quietly in her soul. One spring morning, something unusual happened in town. A well-known television show announced that it was coming to film auditions in their area. It was a talent show, one of those programs that mixed both serious performers and funny acts, where audiences clapped, laughed, or jeered. Flyers appeared at the grocery store, at the library, and even on the bulletin board near Margaret's street. The whole town buzzed with excitement. Young people dreamed of being discovered. Shopkeepers joked that maybe they should show off their hidden skills. It became the main topic of conversation everywhere. Margaret heard about it too, though she paid little attention. She thought to herself, that is for the young ones, not for me. Yet fate had its own plans. One afternoon, as she was picking up milk at the store, she overheard two of the producers from the show speaking with the manager. They were looking for interesting faces from the town. When they spotted Margaret walking past with her groceries, one of them smirked. They whispered to each other, and then walked over. With wide, fake smiles, they told her she looked like the perfect candidate for their show. Confused, Margaret asked why they wanted her. They replied, "Oh, it will be fun. The audience loves when people from all walks of life come on stage. Just think of it as a chance to share something about yourself." Margaret hesitated. She was shy and had never been on television. But the producers spoke kindly, assuring her it was nothing serious, just a bit of light-hearted fun. She did not know that, in truth, they had spotted her because they thought an old woman fumbling on stage would be amusing for viewers. To them, she was not a person with hidden depths but a character to be laughed at. Margaret, however, could not see their secret intentions. She thought perhaps this was a small opportunity to try something new, to step outside her quiet life. After some persuasion, she agreed. When she returned home that evening, she sat in her chair thinking about what she could possibly do on the show. Her life was simple, she was not a dancer, not a singer, and she certainly was not going to perform tricks or comedy. Then her mind wandered to the days of her youth, to the music that once filled her home and her heart. She remembered the way her fingers used to glide across the piano keys, the way melodies seemed to flow like water, the way audiences once clapped with joy. A small smile touched her lips. Maybe, she thought softly, I could play again. It had been many years since her hands had touched a real piano. She worried whether her fingers were still nimble enough, whether her memory would guide her through the notes. But something deep inside whispered that she should not ignore this chance. She chose a simple piece of music to practice in her mind, recalling the notes from memory as she tapped her fingers lightly on the table. She kept it private, not even telling her neighbors what she planned. To everyone else, it was just an amusing thought that Mrs. Margaret would be on TV. Some even joked kindly, maybe you'll become famous. She only laughed softly in response. The day of the audition came quickly. Margaret woke up early, put on her best dress, and carefully pinned her silver hair. She was nervous, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. When she arrived at the studio, she immediately noticed the difference between herself and the other contestants. The room was full of young, energetic performers, singers in glittering clothes, dancers warming up with loud music, and comedians rehearsing their jokes. She felt out of place, like a grandmother who had stepped into a world not meant for her. Some people smiled at her kindly, while others whispered and giggled, wondering what on earth she was doing there. The producers greeted her with exaggerated politeness, leading her toward the stage where a shining grand piano waited. Behind their smiles, they whispered to each other, already imagining the laughter they would provoke once she appeared on screen. Margaret, however, remained unaware. She simply sat quietly in the waiting area, her hands resting calmly on her lap, her heart beating a little faster with every passing minute. As she waited, she thought of her husband, who used to sit beside her during concerts and cheer her on. She thought of her children, who once fell asleep listening to her lullabies on the piano. She thought of the years that had gone by, how life had carried her away from music, and how this strange twist of fate was now bringing her back to it. Instead of fear, a calm determination settled inside her. She whispered to herself, "I will not let them laugh at me. I will play as I always did with love." When her name was finally called, she rose slowly, her back straight, and walked toward the stage. The bright studio lights made her eyes squint, and the crowd stirred with curious murmurs. The host introduced her with a mocking smile, making jokes about her age and asking if she remembered when televisions were still black and white. The audience laughed lightly, expecting a silly act. Margaret did not respond. She only walked to the piano with quiet grace, her steps steady, her heart calm. She placed her hands gently on the keys, ready to begin, completely unaware that in a few moments, she would change everything. Margaret stood on the stage, the bright lights making her eyes blink as she looked around. The room was full of strangers, judges sitting with serious expressions, producers hiding behind cameras, and an audience that had been primed to expect something amusing. Many people leaned forward with curious smiles, waiting for the old woman to make a mistake. Some even whispered to each other, their laughter soft but sharp enough for Margaret to sense the mood. She felt the weight of all those eyes on her, but instead of shrinking, she quietly folded her hands in her lap and waited for the host to finish his introduction. The host, a man known for his sharp jokes, exaggerated her age again. He told the audience she had lived through 3 different centuries of music and asked with a laugh if she could still remember how to play. The audience chuckled politely. Margaret did not answer, she only smiled faintly, keeping her dignity. She knew they expected her to stumble, but she had already decided she would not let their mockery bother her. Instead, she focused on the piano in front of her. It had been years since she sat at such a beautiful instrument. Its polished surface reflected the lights, and its keys seemed to wait for her touch. One of the producers whispered instructions to the crew. They dimmed the lights around the stage, leaving only a spotlight on Margaret. It was meant to look dramatic, but in truth, it also increased the pressure. The judges glanced at one another with raised brows, already assuming the act would be short and forgettable. The audience settled back in their chairs, some with amused smiles, ready to enjoy what they believed would be a comical moment. Margaret, however, simply sat calmly, adjusting the bench to her height, and placed her hands gently on her lap. The silence stretched. It was not a silence of respect yet, but rather one of expectation, the kind that comes before laughter. People thought she might forget what she was doing. They thought her shaking hands would fail her. Yet, Margaret had something they did not expect: years of memory, years of passion, and years of practice hidden inside her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, and remembered the days when she was young, when music filled every corner of her home, when her husband watched her with pride, when her children clapped their little hands to the rhythm. These memories steadied her nerves. She opened her eyes again, calm and ready. The host leaned toward the microphone and teased her again, "Are you sure you're ready, Mrs. Margaret? Don't forget, this isn't the town library." Laughter echoed through the hall. Margaret did not answer him. She only lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Her fingers, though aged and lined, rested on the piano with confidence, like old friends reunited after many years. For a brief moment, the audience leaned forward, still waiting for the stumble they were sure would come. But Margaret did not stumble. She pressed the first key gently, and the note rang clear and pure across the hall. The sound was like a whisper of truth cutting through the room. She pressed another, then another, and soon the opening notes of a classical piece filled the air. The audience, expecting shaky hands and wrong notes, heard instead the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Whispers stopped. Laughter faded. Even the mocking host grew quiet, his smile stiffening as he realized this was not going as planned. Margaret played with a calm grace that came from years of practice long ago. Her fingers, though older, moved with surprising precision. At first, the audience was in disbelief. They had been told to expect a funny act, but what they were hearing was not funny at all, it was beautiful. A soft melody flowed like a gentle river, rising and falling, filling every corner of the hall. People glanced at one another, unsure of how to react. Some even gasped quietly, their faces changing from amusement to awe. Behind the cameras, the producers shifted uncomfortably. This was not the reaction they had hoped for. They had invited her to be a joke, but instead, she was commanding attention in the most unexpected way. One of them whispered angrily, "This isn't what we planned." But there was nothing they could do now. The music had taken hold of the room. As Margaret continued, the hall began to transform. The once restless audience now sat still, their eyes fixed on the stage. The judges leaned forward, their pens forgotten, their eyes widening with surprise. Margaret's hands moved across the piano as if time had rolled back, as if she were once again the young woman who played with passion and love. Each note carried a piece of her life, her struggles, her joys, her quiet strength. The audience could feel it, even if they could not explain it. For Margaret, the stage melted away. She no longer saw the lights, the cameras, or the skeptical faces. She was back in her old living room, with the sun streaming through the window, her children sitting on the floor, her husband smiling proudly in the corner. Every note was a memory. Every chord was a story. She was not playing to impress the judges or the crowd, she was playing to remind herself that music was still a part of her, alive and strong. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, the atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. There was no more laughter. The smirks had disappeared. Instead, there was silence, true silence, the kind that comes when people are completely absorbed in what they are experiencing. A woman in the front row had tears in her eyes. A young boy sitting with his family leaned forward, fascinated by the way her fingers danced across the keys. Even the host, who had mocked her moments earlier, now stood frozen, his microphone lowered, his expression stunned. Margaret's playing grew stronger, her confidence blooming with every passing second. The notes rang out with clarity, filling the hall with a beauty no one had expected. Some of the judges exchanged glances, their eyes wide, their disbelief slowly turning into admiration. One even whispered to another, "This is extraordinary." But Margaret did not notice them. She was lost in the music, her heart guiding her hands, her soul speaking through the keys. As she neared the end of her piece, the melody rose, then softened, then rose again, like waves against the shore. The audience held their breath, not wanting to miss a single note. Margaret's eyes glistened as she played the final chords, her fingers pressing the keys with both strength and tenderness. The sound lingered in the air for a long moment, wrapping around everyone in the room, before fading into silence. When the last note faded, there was stillness. For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was as if time itself had paused. Then, all at once, the hall erupted in applause. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, even shouting her name. The same audience that had come prepared to laugh was now giving her a standing ovation. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. She bowed her head slightly, a soft smile on her face, not proud in an arrogant way, but simply grateful to have shared something dear to her heart. The judges clapped too, their earlier skepticism erased. The producers, who had planned to mock her, now scrambled to adjust their cameras to capture every angle of her success. Even the host, red-faced and humbled, joined in the applause, unable to deny the power of what he had just witnessed. Margaret rose slowly from the bench, her back straight, her dignity intact. She had not only played the piano, she had reminded everyone in the hall of the timeless beauty of true talent, no matter the age of the person holding it. The sound of clapping filled the hall like thunder, echoing against the walls and reaching every corner. Margaret stood quietly beside the piano, her hands folded together as she gave a small bow. She looked calm, but inside her heart beat quickly, not with fear but with relief and joy. She had done it. She had played the music that lived inside her for so many years, and people had listened. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as an old woman to be pitied, but as someone who still had a gift to share. The judges leaned forward, each one eager to speak. Normally, they would exchange jokes or cutting remarks before giving their comments, but this time their voices carried a different tone. One judge, a younger man known for his harsh words, shook his head in disbelief before speaking. "Mrs. Margaret," he said slowly, "I'll be honest, I didn't expect that. None of us did. But what you just did was remarkable." His voice softened, something the audience rarely heard from him. "Your playing was not only technically good, it was filled with emotion. It felt like every note told a story. I was moved. Truly moved." The crowd cheered again, clapping for her. Margaret smiled faintly and nodded, as though she was grateful but did not need the applause. Another judge, an older woman with silver hair of her own, leaned closer to the microphone. "Margaret," she said warmly, "the world tells us that talent belongs only to the young. But you just reminded everyone here that beauty and artistry have no age limit. You played with a depth that only comes from a life fully lived. You touched us all." Her words brought even more applause. Some in the audience stood again, clapping hard enough that their hands grew red. The third judge, who was usually more focused on entertainment than talent, looked shaken. He rubbed his chin before finally speaking. "You know," he said, "I came here tonight ready to laugh. I thought this would be a funny act. But you silenced all of us with your music. That takes real power. I respect you deeply for what you just gave us." Margaret listened politely, but inside she felt something different from pride. What she felt was peace. For so many years, she had kept her music hidden, afraid it belonged only to her past. But standing there, hearing the applause, she knew now that music was not something that faded with time. It was still alive inside her, and it had the power to touch people, no matter how many years had passed. The host returned to the stage, his usual confidence dimmed. Only moments ago, he had made jokes at her expense, expecting the audience to laugh along with him. Now, he stood awkwardly with a microphone in hand, unsure how to continue. He forced a smile and said, "Well, I think we can all agree, Mrs. Margaret has surprised us tonight." The crowd roared with approval, drowning out his nervous voice. He tried to speak again, but the audience shouted Margaret's name, clapping and cheering, leaving him visibly unsettled. For once, the spotlight wasn't on him, but on the woman he had underestimated. Margaret left the stage quietly, guided by one of the crew members. As she walked backstage, many of the younger contestants who had watched her earlier now ran toward her, their faces full of admiration. A teenage girl with sparkling clothes and heavy makeup grabbed her hand. "You were amazing," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. "I thought you were going to play something small, but that was incredible. You're better than most of us here." Others nodded, giving her smiles, pats on the back, and words of praise. Margaret chuckled softly, touched by their kindness. "Thank you, dears," she said gently, "I only played from my heart. That's all any of us can do." Her humility only made them admire her more. For many of these young performers, who were focused on fame and competition, Margaret's words reminded them of something simple, that true art comes from honesty, not from trying to impress. Meanwhile, backstage staff members whispered nervously among themselves. The producers, who had set her up to be mocked, were now scrambling to adjust their plans. They had expected to air her as comic relief, but the reality had turned into a moving performance that captured the entire audience. One producer muttered angrily, "We can't cut this. People will talk about it. We'll look like fools if we try to spin it as a joke." Another sighed and said, "Fine, we'll play it straight. She's the surprise of the season. That's good TV too." Margaret, unaware of their conversations, sat quietly in the corner with a glass of water. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the applause still echo in her ears. She thought of her husband again, imagining how proud he would be if he had been there to see it. She thought of her children, wondering if they might see the broadcast and realize their mother still carried the music of her youth. For a brief moment, she felt tears forming, but she quickly brushed them away. This was not a time for sadness. It was a time for gratitude. The show continued with other acts, singers, comedians, dancers, but none seemed to hold the same weight as Margaret's performance. The audience clapped politely, but many still whispered about the old woman who had taken their breath away. By the time the evening ended, her name was on everyone's lips. Even as she walked out of the studio, strangers approached her with warm smiles, shaking her hand, thanking her for reminding them of the power of music. When she returned home that night, she placed her small handbag on the table and sat in her favorite chair by the window. The town was quiet, the streets dark, but in her heart, she felt a glow. She looked at her hands, still tingling from the keys, and whispered to herself, "You still remember. After all these years, you still remember." She closed her eyes and let the memory of the stage replay in her mind, a gift she would keep forever. But outside her little house, the story was already spreading faster than she could imagine. Clips of her performance were uploaded online by audience members who had filmed it on their phones. Within hours, videos of the old woman at the piano were circulating, gathering millions of views. People all over the country shared her story, some writing messages like, "Never underestimate anyone," and others saying, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Her name trended on social media platforms, and journalists began calling the producers, asking for interviews with her. Back in her town, neighbors who had always thought of Margaret as just another quiet resident were shocked when they saw her on television. The next morning, the local bakery was full of chatter. "Did you see Mrs. Margaret?" one woman exclaimed. "She was unbelievable." Another added, "I never knew she could play like that. We've lived next to her for years, and she never said a word." Children who had once seen her only as the lady with cookies now pointed at her house with wide eyes, whispering to their friends, "That's where she lives. The piano lady." Margaret woke up to a ringing phone. It was her daughter calling from another city. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we saw you. We all saw you. I can't believe you kept this from us. You were incredible. The kids were cheering for you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, hearing the pride in her daughter's voice. For years, she had thought her time had passed, that her music belonged only to her past. But now, even her own family was seeing her in a new light. That morning, as she watered her garden, neighbors stopped to wave, smile, and congratulate her. Some asked her to play for the community center. Others simply wanted to thank her for reminding them that dreams never truly fade. Margaret smiled politely at each of them, humbled by the sudden attention. She had not played for fame or recognition, she had played because her heart asked her to. But now, she realized, perhaps her music had a larger purpose to inspire others to believe in themselves, no matter their age. And while the world buzzed with excitement over her, Margaret remained the same simple woman she had always been, living quietly in her little home. Yet something had changed forever, she was no longer invisible. She had reminded the world that dignity, talent, and passion do not belong to youth alone, they belong to the human spirit, and that spirit never grows old. Margaret's performance had ended the night before, but its echo did not stop when she left the stage. In fact, her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. By the next morning, her simple story had traveled far beyond the walls of the television studio. Across the country, people woke up to videos of her performance being shared online. Clips of the old woman in her modest dress sitting at the piano and playing with such grace spread like wildfire. News stations replayed it, social media buzzed with admiration, and strangers across the world felt moved by the beauty of her music. At first, Margaret had no idea of the storm she had created. She began her day as always. She rose early, made herself a cup of tea, and tended to the flowers in her garden. To her, life was still ordinary. But as she stepped outside, she noticed something unusual. Neighbors passing by smiled wider than usual, calling out to her from across the street. "We saw you, Margaret," one man shouted, waving. "You were wonderful." A group of children on bicycles stopped at the end of her walkway, cheering and clapping. Margaret blushed and waved politely, unsure of how to respond. Later that morning, the phone began to ring. It was her son calling from another state. His voice was full of emotion. "Mom, I can't believe what I saw. You were amazing." The kids watched it 3 times. "They're telling all their friends their grandmother is a star." Margaret laughed softly, her heart swelling. She never wanted fame, but to hear her children and grandchildren speak with such pride filled her with quiet joy. Soon, more calls came from her daughter, from her nieces, even from old friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Each one told her how proud they were, how touched they felt by her music. Margaret listened with humility, thanking them kindly. She could hardly believe that something she had done so simply, something from her heart, was reaching so many people. Meanwhile, in the city, the producers of the show were in shock. They had expected Margaret's appearance to be a comic interlude, a break in the competition where the audience could laugh. Instead, she had become the highlight of the night. The judges' comments and the audience's standing ovation had sealed her as the most memorable act. "We didn't plan this," one producer muttered, pacing the floor. "But people love her. We have to make her part of the story this season." Another producer nodded, realizing that Margaret had brought something rare to their stage: authenticity, dignity, and true talent. Back in her small town, Margaret's life was turning into something she could hardly comprehend. The local newspaper featured her picture on the front page, calling her the hidden gem of Maple Street. At the grocery store, people stopped her to shake her hand and congratulate her. Children asked if she could teach them piano. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the attention but accepted it with grace. She reminded everyone, "I didn't play for fame. I only played because music has always been my friend." But the truth was, Margaret's performance had touched people on a deeper level. It was not just about her music, it was about what she represented. In a world that often celebrated youth, speed, and glamour, she reminded everyone that true beauty comes from within, and that age does not erase talent. People began writing letters and emails to the show, thanking them for giving her a platform, though the producers knew they hadn't planned it that way. "She inspired me to pick up my violin again," one viewer wrote. Another said, "I'm 70 years old, and I thought my best years were behind me." After seeing Margaret, I believe I can still create something beautiful." Her story was becoming a beacon of hope to many. One evening, Margaret was invited back to the studio for an interview. She felt nervous as she sat under the bright lights, the cameras rolling. The host, who had once mocked her, now sat respectfully beside her, his tone softer. "Margaret," he began, "your performance last week has captured the hearts of millions. Did you expect this kind of reaction?" Margaret smiled gently. "No," she said simply, "I only wanted to share something that has been with me all my life. Music has given me comfort and joy, and I hoped maybe others would feel that too. I never thought it would reach so many people." The host nodded, clearly humbled. "What would you say to people who think age is a limit?" Margaret paused thoughtfully before answering. "I would tell them that age only changes the outside of us. Inside, our hearts still beat the same, our spirits still dream. If you carry love for something, whether it's music, painting, writing, or even kindness, it never truly leaves you. All you have to do is share it, no matter your age." The audience in the studio applauded warmly, many moved by her words. As weeks went by, Margaret's performance continued to spread. Invitations arrived from other shows, community centers, and even orchestras that wanted her to play again. Margaret accepted only a few, preferring to remain in her quiet town. She didn't crave fame or fortune. All she wanted was to play when her heart asked her to, and to remind people that beauty could be found in unexpected places. One weekend, the local community center organized a concert in her honor. The hall was packed with families, neighbors, and even people who had traveled from other towns to see her. Margaret walked onto the stage to a wave of applause, this time not as a surprise contestant, but as a beloved guest. She sat at the piano and played softly, choosing pieces that carried warmth and tenderness. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide with wonder. Parents held hands, smiling at each other as the music filled the room. When Margaret finished, the entire hall stood again, clapping and cheering, their admiration genuine and heartfelt. After the concert, a young girl approached her shyly. "Mrs. Margaret," she said, holding a small notebook, "I want to play piano too. Will you teach me?" Margaret looked down at the girl, her heart touched. She nodded gently. "Of course, dear. I will teach you what I know. And when you play, remember, don't play to impress others. Play because it makes your heart happy." The girl beamed, clutching her notebook tightly, already inspired. That night, Margaret sat at her window, looking out at the stars. She thought of how strange life could be. Only weeks ago, she had been just another quiet figure in her town, invisible to most. Now, she had reminded the world and herself that her gift was still alive. She didn't need trophies or fame, the true reward was seeing how her music had awakened something in others. She realized now that her life still held chapters waiting to be written. And though she never sought the spotlight, it seemed the spotlight had found her. Not to mock her, as the producers first intended, but to celebrate the truth of who she was, a woman who carried dignity, resilience, and a timeless gift. Her talent had blown everyone away, but more importantly, her courage had reminded the world of something they often forgot, that beauty does not fade with age, and true talent shines brightest when shared with love. Margaret's quiet life would never be the same again. Though she still lived in her little house on Maple Street, her days no longer passed in silence. People from all over came to her door with flowers, letters, and gifts, not because she was a celebrity, but because she had touched their hearts. The once invisible woman had become a symbol of hope, dignity, and timeless beauty. But Margaret remained humble. To her, she was still the same woman who tended her garden and brewed her morning tea. She only smiled and said, "I am glad if my music has reminded you of something good." The television show tried to use her newfound fame to boost its ratings. They replayed her performance many times, adding dramatic music and showing the audience's standing ovation. The host, embarrassed by his earlier jokes, spoke kindly of her in interviews, pretending he had always believed in her. The producers released statements praising her unexpected brilliance. But the public was not fooled. Everyone knew the truth that Margaret had been brought in to be mocked, and instead, she had turned the tables. People admired her even more because she had walked into a trap of ridicule and walked out victorious, not with anger, but with grace. Margaret herself did not care about what the producers or the host had intended. She did not waste time on bitterness. Instead, she focused on the good that had come from it all. Letters arrived daily, many from elderly men and women who said her performance gave them courage. "I thought my life was finished," one letter read. "But after seeing you, I took out my paintbrush again." Another wrote, "I am 72, and I signed up for dance classes today because you reminded me that joy has no age." Margaret read each letter with tears in her eyes, feeling that her music had reached places she never could have dreamed. Her children, too, looked at her differently now. They had always loved her, but like many families, they had seen her as just their mother or grandmother, someone ordinary. Now they saw her as extraordinary. Her grandchildren proudly told their friends, "That's my grandma on TV," and even her grown children confessed they had underestimated her. "Mom," her daughter said one day, "I think I never really knew how much you gave up for us. You could have been on big stages all your life. But you chose us. And now the world finally knows what we know. You're amazing." Margaret smiled gently. "I have no regrets," she said. "My music never left me. It waited until the right time to speak again." Soon, invitations arrived for her to travel. She was asked to play at charity events, at schools, and even at concert halls. Margaret was surprised but honored. She accepted only a few, choosing the ones where she felt her music could inspire others rather than simply entertain. One of the most meaningful invitations came from a hospital, where they asked her to play for patients recovering from illness. Margaret sat at the hospital's piano and filled the halls with gentle melodies. Doctors and nurses paused to listen. Patients who had been silent for weeks tapped their fingers to the rhythm. A woman in a wheelchair cried softly, saying it was the first time she felt peace in months. Margaret left that day with her heart full, realizing that music was not just for applause, it was medicine for the soul. Despite all the attention, Margaret never let pride consume her. She returned each evening to her small home, where she lived as she always had. She still cared for her garden, still fed the stray cats, still read her books by the lamp at night. Fame, she realized, was only a passing light. What truly mattered was the connection her music had created between hearts. One evening, as the sun set over Maple Street, Margaret sat at her borrowed piano, practicing quietly. The room was filled with warm golden light. Suddenly, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found a group of children standing there, each holding a small handmade card. "We just wanted to say thank you," one boy said shyly. "You showed us that old people aren't boring. You're amazing." Margaret laughed gently and invited them inside. She played a few simple songs for them, and they clapped with pure joy. It reminded her of her own children when they were small. The weeks turned into months, and Margaret's story continued to inspire. Newspapers still wrote about her from time to time, calling her the piano grandmother or the woman who silenced a crowd. But Margaret did not see herself in those grand titles. She was simply Margaret, a woman who had loved music all her life and finally shared it again. One day, a television reporter asked her the question that many people wanted answered: "What lesson do you think your story teaches the world?" Margaret thought for a long moment before answering. Her voice was soft but steady. "That you should never judge someone by what you see on the surface. People may look old, tired, or ordinary, but inside them can live something extraordinary. Every person carries a treasure, sometimes hidden, sometimes forgotten. But it never disappears. And when the right moment comes, it can shine brighter than anyone expects." The reporter nodded, visibly moved, and the clip of her words spread almost as widely as her performance had. People quoted her, shared her wisdom, and felt encouraged to look at the people around them with new eyes, not with judgment, but with curiosity and respect. Years later, when Margaret was even older and her steps had grown slower, people still remembered her story. Children who had seen her play grew up and told others about the day the old woman silenced a mocking crowd with the power of her music. Some of those children became musicians themselves, saying they had been inspired by her. Others carried her lesson into their own lives, reminding themselves never to underestimate anyone. Margaret herself grew older gracefully, surrounded by family and neighbors who now saw her not just as the kind woman on Maple Street, but as a living reminder of what it means to never give up on yourself. In her final years, she played less often, but whenever she touched the keys, her music still carried the same truth: it was not about fame, but about love, resilience, and the beauty of sharing your heart. Her story became more than just an episode of a television show. It became a legend in her town and beyond. People spoke of her not as someone who embarrassed herself, but as someone who showed the world that dignity and talent could rise above mockery. And though Margaret never sought the spotlight, she had become a light for others, guiding them to believe in their own worth. In the end, what defined her was not that she played on television, or that millions watched her performance. What defined her was the quiet courage she carried, the grace with which she faced ridicule, and the way she chose to answer laughter not with anger but with music. Her life proved a simple but powerful truth: talent and dignity never fade, and the human spirit shines brightest when it refuses to be dimmed.